Laura Bennett arrived at Oak Creek Memorial at 6:44 a.m., 14 minutes before her shift started, the same as every morning for 3 years. The parking lot was still dark, that particular shade of pre-dawn gray that belonged only to hospital workers and insomniacs. She pulled her sedan into the same space, third row, middle section, and sat for exactly 90 seconds with the engine off, a ritual so practiced it required no thought. The dog tag beneath her scrubs caught on the fabric as she reached for her badge, cold against her sternum, a single point of contact between 2 lives. She pressed her palm flat against her chest once, held it there until the metal warmed, then stepped out into air that smelled like diesel exhaust and coming rain. Inside, the hospital breathed its own particular rhythm. The fluorescent lights hummed their permanent frequency, a sound most people stopped hearing within a week of employment. Laura's left ear tilted slightly forward as she passed the ICU station, compensating for the hearing loss she'd never explained to anyone, an occupational detail filed away with other things that didn't require discussion. Her scrubs were navy blue, regulation hospital issue, wrinkled in exactly the same places as everyone else's. Her shoes were white nursing clogs, unremarkable. Her ID badge showed a passport photo from 3 years ago, her name printed in sans serif font, Del Bennett, RN, Trauma Unit. No middle initial. No photograph smile. The night shift nurses were giving report in the trauma bay, their voices the low-volume murmur of people who'd been awake for 12 hours and were counting the minutes until they could leave. Sarah Chen, the charge nurse, barely glanced up as Laura entered. Good. The invisibility was the point. Laura had spent 3 years cultivating it like a garden, small silences, careful deference, the deliberate absence of opinions about anything beyond protocol. She had been a question mark for so long that people stopped asking questions. She changed into the rest of her equipment with practiced efficiency, stethoscope draped around her neck, trauma shears clipped to her pocket, a second for kit in her locker even though the hospital provided them. Muscle memory. Redundancy. Never run out of what you need when lives depend on speed. The morning rounds began at 7:15, which meant Dr. Richard Ashford would arrive sometime between 7:30 and 7:45, depending on whether his parking spot was available and whether he'd stopped for coffee at the cafe 3 blocks away. He was not a man who rushed. Richard Ashford carried his authority like a piece of expensive luggage, visible, expensive, impossible to miss. 32 years as chief of surgery had calcified his certainty into something that moved through the hospital like weather, something the building arranged itself around. He had mentored 2 hospital administrators who'd become VPs. He served on 3 state medical boards. He had a photograph in the hallway with a governor from 2008. The surgical wing was his territory, and every surgeon in it understood they occupied his space by his permission. At 7:38, Mr. Morales began to deteriorate. He was 61, 3 days post-gallbladder surgery, had been doing well until he wasn't. His oxygen saturation dropped from 96 to 89 in the space of 4 minutes, a slide so gradual that most people wouldn't notice unless they were watching the monitor. Laura was watching the monitor. She was always watching the monitors. She was at his bedside before the alarm sounded, reading the pattern before the machine could announce it, the slight tightening around his eyes, the change in breathing rhythm that was visible if you knew how to look for it. She had learned that skill in a field hospital in Sangin, where the machine sometimes didn't work and you relied on what your eyes could tell you about oxygen saturation and perfusion and whether a person was about to stop breathing. Increase to 6 liters, she said, already reaching for the oxygen tubing. Not a request. A statement of fact. Sarah Chen jumped to it, hooking the nasal cannula up to the higher flow, and Laura stayed at the bedside, one hand on Mr. Morales' shoulder, feeling his breathing synchronize with her own, a trick they'd taught her at Naval Hospital Bagram, how to breathe with the panicking patient until the panic subsided. What's happening? Mr. Morales' voice was thin. Scared. Just a little dip on your numbers, Laura said, her voice steady as a held note. We're fixing it. You're okay. His oxygen came up. 91, 93. 95, the monitor beeped its approval. His breathing slowed. By the time Dr. Ashford arrived at 7:44, the crisis had already resolved itself, and Mr. Morales was stable, his numbers climbing toward normal, Laura's hand still on his shoulder like she was holding something in place. Dr. Ashford took in the scene from the doorway with the assessment of a man who believed he'd already identified the problem before entering the room. The code cart was still out. The elevated oxygen tubing was still running. Laura was still at the bedside. He walked past her without acknowledgement and checked the vital signs monitor himself, as if her presence there for the last 6 minutes meant nothing. As if her hands hadn't just prevented something worse. BP 118/71, he said to the room, speaking to whoever needed to hear it wasn't a crisis anymore. Stable. Good work, everyone. Not looking at Laura. Never looking at Laura. Let's move on. The morning rounds continued through the ICU, Dr. Ashford leading the small parade of interns and residents who followed him like satellites orbiting the sun. They moved from patient to patient with the rhythm of ritual, each room a checkpoint, each update a confirmation of his authority. Laura trailed slightly behind, maintaining the careful distance that suggested she was present but not essential, available but not invested. She had perfected this distance over 36 months. It was exhausting in ways that physical labor never was. By 8:12 a.m., they reached the end of rounds and gathered for the daily briefing in the small conference room adjacent to the ICU. The room smelled like stale coffee and the particular staleness of air-conditioned spaces, and someone had left a half-eaten muffin on the table. Laura stood at the back, near the door, where she could move into the hallway without drawing attention. Dr. Ashford sat at the head of the table, his lab coat draped over the chair back, his hands folded in front of him in a posture that suggested he was about to deliver something important. "I want to talk about our response times," he began, his voice carrying the weight of a man who believed he was addressing a problem everyone had missed. "Specifically, I'm concerned that some of our younger staff are getting ahead of the attending physicians. Jumping to conclusions. Taking actions without proper authorization." Laura felt the weight of it immediately, the way the words found her even though her name wasn't mentioned. She kept her expression neutral, her breathing unchanged. The trick was to become even more invisible, to blend so completely into the background that you stopped existing as a target. "Protocol exists for a reason," Dr. Ashford continued. "We move methodically. We assess. We consult. We don't make snap decisions based on," he paused, and in that pause was everything. "Incomplete information." One of the interns shifted uncomfortably. Sarah Chen suddenly became very interested in her coffee cup. Laura remained perfectly still, every muscle controlled, the way you stayed calm during an ambush. "Don't move. Don't speak. Don't give them a target to lock onto." "I appreciate the enthusiasm," Dr. Ashford said, his voice taking on that particular tone of false kindness that cut deeper than anger. "But enthusiasm without judgment is dangerous. For the patients and for us legally. Let's remember who's running this unit and who's just helping out. Just helping out." The words landed exactly where he intended them to land, and Laura felt the weight of them settle on her shoulders like something physical. She had managed a trauma unit in Sangin with 14 personnel, made decisions that saved lives when the nearest surgeon was 40 kilometers away and the mortars were close enough that you could hear them coming. But that was 3 years ago, in a life she'd promised herself she would never return to, in a country she'd promised herself she would never think about again. The dog tag pressed cold against her sternum, and she pressed back. "I want to make sure we're all clear on the chain of command," Dr. Ashford said, his eyes finally flicking toward the back of the room, toward Laura, a glance that lasted exactly 1 second before moving on. "Questions?" There were no questions. There were never questions. Dr. Ashford had constructed a hierarchy so complete that dissent had become physically difficult, like trying to speak underwater. He stood, dismissing them with a small gesture, and the staff began gathering their things, filing out of the conference room with the careful silence of people who had just witnessed a demonstration of power and understood they had no role in it. Laura waited until everyone else had left before moving toward the door. She had learned to be last in every room, a habit from the field where last meant you were covering the exit. She was almost to the hallway when Dr. Ashford's voice caught her. "Ms. Bennett." She turned, her face already composed into an expression of polite attentiveness. This was the first time he'd spoken her name directly. That itself was significant. That itself was a change in the weather. The patient this morning. Mr. Morales. He was standing now, putting on his lab coat with deliberate movements. The oxygen adjustment. Who authorized that? The question was simple. The answer was simpler. She had authorized it, reading the numbers on a monitor and recognizing a pattern that required immediate intervention. But that wasn't the answer he was looking for. That wasn't the answer he could tolerate. I noticed the saturation dropping, Laura said, her voice pitched low and deferential, the voice she used to be small. I increased the oxygen. Standard protocol for post-op patients. Dr. Ashford smiled. It was the kind of smile that looked like a smile if you weren't paying attention, but if you'd ever seen a predator recognize weakness, you understood what it meant. Let me make something very clear, he said, his words taking on a texture like ice. Those patients are my responsibility. Not yours. When you notice something, and I appreciate that you notice things, you come to me. You don't just act. You consult. You ask. You remember that you're a nurse here. Not a doctor. Just a nurse. The words hung in the air like a question, and Laura held still while they settled. She had been called worse. She had been called things that came attached to bullets and screaming and the smell of burning metal. Those words rolled off her like water. But there was something about the way Dr. Ashford delivered this one that was calculated, that was meant to establish the exact boundaries of her worth in this space, in this life she'd built. I understand, Doctor, she said, and meant it in a way he would never comprehend. She understood exactly where she stood. She understood exactly what he believed she was. She turned and walked back to the trauma unit, back to the patient rooms and the monitors and the work that required no voice and no authority, just hands and attention and the ability to recognize when something was about to go wrong. The dog tag moved against her skin as she walked, warm now, a rhythm like a second heartbeat. 3 years she'd kept it there. 3 years of carrying something that no one could see, something that belonged to a different life, a different person, a woman with a rank and a command and a set of responsibilities that had nearly killed her. The morning stretched ahead of her, 12 hours of carefully calibrated invisibility, 12 hours of being overlooked and underestimated, and Laura Bennett moved through Oak Creek Memorial like fog, present, essential, invisible, while something cold and certain turned over in her chest. The morning rounds at Oak Creek Memorial began the way they always did, Dr. Ashford in his white coat, moving like a man accustomed to rooms parting for him, his voice carrying the particular cadence of someone who'd spent 30 years conditioning people to listen. Laura had learned to move beside him without occupying space, a shadow in scrubs, present but unremarkable. That Tuesday felt different. The air held something electric, something waiting. She didn't know yet what was coming. The Morales family occupied Bedford in the cardiac wing. Mr. Morales had arrested twice during the night, his rhythm deteriorating despite the standard interventions, his daughter gripping the bed rail like it was the only solid thing left in her collapsing world. During morning rounds, Dr. Ashford reviewed the chart with his characteristic precision, each word a small assertion of dominance. Laura stood 2 feet back, watching the monitor, noting something in the pattern that didn't align with his treatment plan. The medications he'd ordered the previous evening, they were appropriate, standard, but they were also delayed. 8 minutes late from the time she'd flagged the change in rhythm. 8 minutes in a cardiac emergency was the difference between recovery and catastrophe. She waited until the attending moved toward the door, until the family was watching, until the moment had maximum visibility. Dr. Ashford, the interval between the dysrhythmia change and your medication order, her voice was quiet, clinical, nothing confrontational in it. Just observation. His face transformed. Not anger exactly. Something colder. He turned slowly, and she saw something flicker across his expression, recognition that she'd challenged him, that she'd done it in front of the Morales family, that she'd spoken as if her clinical assessment held weight. Nurse Bennett. A word. He didn't step into the hallway. He didn't lower his voice. He turned to face her while Mr. Morales' daughter stared, while his wife held the chart like a shield, while the machines beat their steady mechanical rhythm in the background. "Your clinical judgment is dangerously inadequate," he said, each word precise as a scalpel. "You are a nurse, not a physician. When I want your opinion on treatment protocols, I'll request it, which will be never." He shifted his gaze to the family without breaking rhythm. "I apologize for my staff's overreach. She forgets her place." The silence that followed tasted like copper. Laura's hand moved unconsciously, fingers brushing the dog tag beneath her scrubs, a single piece of metal on a broken chain, all that remained of a life she'd buried 3 years ago. One tear escaped her right eye. She didn't try to stop it. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, maintaining eye contact with Dr. Ashford the entire time, her face composed with the kind of calm that comes from having survived worse. Much worse. "Understood, Doctor," she said, her voice steady as a held note, devastatingly calm, and turned back to Mr. Morales for without another word. She adjusted the drip with hands that didn't shake, checked the line placement with the same methodical precision she'd applied to field trauma in Sangin, and didn't look at the family again. Dr. Ashford watched her work for 3 seconds, then left, his presence lifting from the room like pressure equalizing. The Morales family stared at the floor. The break room exile began that afternoon. Laura arrived at 15:30, peeling off her gloves, planning to eat the sandwich she'd brought that morning before her next rotation started. The room smelled like microwaved coffee and the antiseptic underlayer that never quite left hospital spaces. Karen was there, veteran trauma nurse, 5 years seniority, someone Laura had worked beside through 3 consecutive night shifts. Karen looked up, and Laura watched her face shift. "Oh, just remembered," Karen said, already standing. "Medication reconciliation for room 12. Probably should." She grabbed her half-eaten sandwich off the table and left without finishing the sentence. Tom followed 30 seconds later. No excuse. Just stood and walked out, the door hissing closed behind him. By the time Laura unwrapped her sandwich, the room felt colder. She sat alone, the fluorescent lights overhead casting everything in that particular institutional yellow, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound besides the distant bells of the unit. She ate mechanically, tasting nothing, understanding something shifting in the hospital's social architecture. This wasn't coincidence. This was orchestrated. By day 3, she didn't bother trying the break room. She sat in her car in the parking garage, door open to the concrete and exhaust smell, eating her lunch while rain threatened in the distance. The isolation crystallized around her like ice forming on a lake, slow, inevitable, comprehensive. When she entered any room where nursing staff gathered, conversation stopped. Urgent tasks materialized. People suddenly needed to be elsewhere. The write-up came Friday morning, posted on the unit board at the shift change station where every nurse in the hospital passed multiple times daily. Laura saw it when she arrived for her rotation. The paper was crisp, printed on official hospital letterhead, her name in bold letters, formal reprimand, Laura Bennett, RN. Insubordination and procedural deviation. Failure to respect established chain of command. Signed and dated by Dr. Ashford, witnessed by 2 administrators whose names she didn't recognize. She stood in front of it for almost a minute, reading each word twice, her hands perfectly still. Dr. Ashford watched from the nurse's station 30 feet away, arms crossed, a slight smile playing at the corner of his mouth. She could feel his satisfaction radiating across the distance like heat. One tear escaped. Just one, from her right eye. She wiped it away without turning, without breaking her gaze from the paper, her face remaining composed. A nurse walked past, Marcus Chen, IT director, former Marine, and she caught him seeing her, caught the flash of something uncomfortable cross his expression. He didn't leave. He didn't pretend not to notice. He just slowed his pace slightly, as if bearing witness mattered. "You've made your point, Doctor," she said quietly, not looking at Ashford, speaking to no one in particular, her voice carrying that same devastating calm she'd used in the patient room. The words weren't a question or a plea. They were a statement of fact, delivered with the kind of acceptance that comes from knowing there's nothing left to negotiate. She pulled the next chart from the rack and returned to her rounds, moving through the unit with the same methodical precision she'd maintained for 3 years. But something had shifted internally, something that made her hand brush the dog tag more frequently, something that made her breath catch differently when she passed the ICU. The facade was holding, but she could feel the structure creaking beneath it, could sense the weight pressing down from above. The machines beeped their steady rhythm. The rain started outside, tapping against the windows with the sound of impatience. And Laura Bennett moved through Oak Creek Memorial with the strange calm of someone who understood that systems designed to break you never actually work the first time, that institutions built on hierarchy and fear have a particular vulnerability to people who've already survived far worse. What she didn't know was that on the very next day, a man would arrive in the ICU waiting room, a man with the bearing of someone accustomed to command, someone whose collapse would force her to choose between staying invisible and becoming unforgettable. The Admiral collapsed like a building losing its foundation. 1 second he was standing in the ICU waiting room, shoulders back, the kind of posture that comes from 40 years wearing a uniform. The next second his hand went to his chest and he dropped, his body hitting the tile floor with the flat finality of something that couldn't be caught. Code Blue, ICU waiting room, someone shouted, but the voice came from very far away. Laura was 2 hallways over, checking a patient's foresight, when the intercom crackled and split the afternoon into before and after. The words didn't really matter. Her body already knew. Her hands already knew. The part of her that had spent 20 years in Sangin, in field hospitals under fire, in the moments where hesitation meant watching someone die, that part woke up like a predator scenting blood on the wind. She moved before her conscious mind caught up with her legs. The waiting room had already begun its panic ballet by the time she arrived. A woman, the Admiral's daughter, probably, Laura registered without thinking, was screaming. 2 nurses were looking for crash carts that hadn't yet materialized. And Dr. Ashford stood frozen by the doorway like someone had hit pause on his life, his hands hanging at his sides, his face draining to a color that wasn't compatible with living. The Admiral was clutching his sternum, his breathing shallow and wrong. Not cardiac rhythm disturbance. Not simple MI. The way his eyes widened, the way his body arched, the specific quality of agony etched across his face, that was aortic dissection. Type A. The kind that killed you if you were lucky fast, and killed you slow and screaming if you weren't. Someone get Dr. Ashford, one of the nurses said, still looking for the crash cart. Dr. Ashford was standing right there. He didn't move. Get me the thoracotomy kit and 2 units O negative, now, Laura heard herself say, except it wasn't the voice of the quiet trauma nurse who took his insults without breaking. This voice came from a deeper register, one that belonged to someone who had issued orders in operating theaters that smelled like diesel and copper and fear. The authority in it cut through the confusion like a scalpel through skin. A resident opened his mouth to protest. To ask who the hell gave her permission. Move, she said. He moved. Laura was already kneeling, already assessing, her hands moving through the examination with the terrible precision of muscle memory. The Admiral's vitals were collapsing in real time. BP dropping. Oxygen saturation following it down like a sinking stone. If she called for a proper surgical team, waited for the OR prep, the correct chain of command, he'd be dead before they got him on the table. She could feel the seconds running out like sand through broken glass. There was no choice. There had never been a choice. The moment he hit the floor, the outcome was already written in her hands. She grabbed the scalpel from the crash cart before someone finally wheeled it in. The blade felt like recognition. The Admiral's chest was exposed in 3 practice motions. She didn't have time for proper draping, for sterile protocols that belonged to a world where people had the luxury of minutes. This was Sangin logic, field hospital calculus, the mathematics of triage under fire translated into fluorescent-lit American terms. The scalpel cracked his sternum with a sound like breaking ice. Blood bloomed across her gloved hands. The dissection was exactly where she knew it would be, the aorta torn like a tapestry separating in 2 directions. Her fingers found the tear with the certainty of someone who had held this exact wound together before, though never in a hospital where people wore their shoes indoors and the blood was somebody important. "Suction," she barked. A nurse scrambled forward with the apparatus. "Cross-clamp, left side, now." A surgical resident fumbled for the instrument. She positioned it herself, her hands moving faster than thought, and the bleeding slowed to something that wasn't death anymore. Something you could work with. Vascular on the phone, tell them type a dissection, manual compression, 20 minutes to surgical intervention, she said, and someone was already dialing, their hands shaking. The Admiral's oxygen saturation ticked upward. 75. 80. The heart rhythm stabilized into something that resembled sinus rhythm. His blood pressure climbed back toward numbers that meant he might actually see the operating room. The entire surgical wing had stopped moving. Nurses crowded the ICU entrance, their phones already out, recording, documenting, unable to look away from the quiet trauma nurse with blood past her elbows, holding a Navy admiral's aorta together with her hands and a level of composure that belonged to people who had already seen the worst the world could offer. Someone whispered, "Who is she?" No one answered because no one knew. The vascular surgeon arrived running, her footsteps echoing against tile that suddenly felt very loud. She took one look at Laura's hands inside the Admiral's chest cavity, at the perfect technique of the emergency thoracotomy, at the way compression was being maintained with the muscle memory of someone who had done this exact procedure in a place where mortars fell like rain, and her face shifted through confusion to comprehension to something that might have been awe. "Jesus Christ," she said quietly. "Who are you?" Laura didn't answer. She held compression, counting seconds, feeling the Admiral's heartbeat stabilize under her palms, and somewhere in the back of her mind, the part of her that had spent 3 years trying to be invisible understood that invisibility had just become impossible. The dog tag beneath her scrubs felt heavier than physics could explain, pressing against her sternum like an accusation. The vascular surgeon took over the compression. Laura stepped back, her hand shaking now, not from fear, but from the trembling that comes after, the body's way of processing that it had just burned through 3 years of careful deception in 90 seconds. Dr. Ashford arrived as they were wheeling the Admiral toward the elevator that would take him to surgery. He stood in the ICU entrance like someone who had just watched his entire world recalibrate. His eyes tracked from the Admiral's still bleeding chest to the crowd of witnesses to Laura standing there covered in blood, her composure already clicking back into place like a weapon being holstered. His face cycled through expressions like a broken computer. Confusion. Rage. And then the slow, terrible calculation of someone realizing that the quiet nurse he had spent weeks systematically destroying had just saved the life of someone with enough authority to make his calculations meaningless. "Conference room," he said, his voice tight as a closed fist. "Bennett. Now." But she was already walking toward the scrub room, her legs steady, her breathing controlled, the mask of civilian competence sliding back over her face like armor. Behind her, she could hear the surgeon asking questions, could hear the nurses talking in urgent whispers, could feel the weight of 100 eyes trying to solve a puzzle that had just been handed to them fully assembled. She scrubbed her hands at the sink, watching the Admiral's blood spiral down the drain, and didn't let herself shake until she was alone in the bathroom stall with the door locked and her forehead against cool tile. 47 seconds. She gave herself 47 seconds. Then she stood, straightened her scrubs, and stepped back into Oak Creek Memorial like a soldier returning to occupied territory. Dr. Ashford moved with surgical precision, and within 48 hours, Laura's entire world dismantled like a patient under anesthesia. The first strike came Monday morning. She arrived for her shift to find her name erased from the trauma schedule, transferred wholesale to medical surgical floors she'd never worked, units where patients were stable and boring and required no decision-making beyond charting vitals. The roster had been rewritten in Dr. Ashford's handwriting, her signature on the change order backdated to Sunday night. When she tried to check the Admiral's status in the ICU, security stopped her at the unit entrance, their hands resting on duty belts with the casual authority of men following orders from above. Dr. Ashford's orders, the guard said, not meeting her eyes. "You're restricted from this unit pending investigation." Restricted. The word hung in the air like a diagnosis. She went to the administrator's office. The door was closed. 3 voicemails waited from hospital legal, 2 from her union rep, 1 from a number with no context. By Tuesday, the calculated calls had begun. Dr. Ashford spent his morning making rounds with a phone pressed to his ear, speaking in measured tones to board members about reckless cowboy medicine and massive liability exposure from a nurse who'd performed an unauthorized surgical procedure in violation of scope of practice, chain of command, hospital protocol. He cited malpractice insurance concerns, regulatory violations, the precedent it set for other nursing staff to believe they could override physician authority. She heard echoes of these conversations from nurses who'd overheard him in the hallway, in the break room where no one would sit beside her anymore, by the medication dispensary where conversations died when she approached. By Wednesday, her building access was restricted. The badge scanner at the employee entrance blinked red 3 times before the system locked. Security arrived while she stood in the lobby trying to understand why her own hospital had become occupied territory. "See hospital administration," the desk guard said, his voice empty of sympathy. The suspension letter arrived Thursday, delivered by 2 witnesses from HR who watched her sign the acknowledgement with a pen that felt heavier than it should. Effective immediately, pending investigation into unauthorized medical procedures and violation of scope of practice. Your hospital access is revoked. Your clinical privileges are suspended. You will not enter patient care areas or discuss this matter with staff. The words were typed in 12-point Arial, impersonal as a drone strike. Laura read it standing in the hallway while nurses she'd worked beside for 3 years looked away, their silence a form of agreement. She took the letter without trembling, without anger, without the break in her voice that would have made them feel better, made them feel like her suffering was real, manageable, human. Instead, she nodded and walked out, and that composure was the cruelest thing she could have given them because it meant she wasn't begging, wasn't broken, wasn't fighting for her reputation. She was simply gone. That night, she sat in her car in the parking garage at Oak Creek Memorial, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like angry wasps trapped in plastic. The engine was dead. Her head rested on the steering wheel. Rain hammered the windshield like artillery, and she couldn't move, couldn't think past the weight of 3 years of silence collapsing all at once. Her phone showed 6 missed calls from numbers she didn't recognize, their area codes federal, their persistence the sound of a system that never stopped hunting. The parking garage smelled like oil and wet concrete and defeat. Her uniform was still damp from the rain, still carrying the copper scent of Admiral Kincaid's blood, a scent that civilian trauma nurses learned to ignore but that Major Bennett, the woman she'd buried, recognized as the signature of a life saved. The dog tag pressed against her sternum. She pulled it out slowly, held the single metal tag in her palm, and read the name stamped there in military precision, Bennett, LMOPOS. Navy. The letters didn't seem to belong to anyone she'd become. They belonged to a woman who'd commanded field operations in Sangin, whose hands had held together lives that shouldn't have survived, whose hearing in her left ear had been taken by an IED along with her entire future. She'd promised herself when she took the civilian discharge that she was done with that life. The promotion to major, the 18 months commanding a trauma surgical team under fire, the 237 lives extracted and stabilized and sent home, all of it was supposed to stay buried in the classified file that the Pentagon locked away when her medical discharge went through. She'd promised the dog tag's twin, lost in the explosion that took her hearing, that she would use her second chance to be ordinary. Just a nurse. Just a woman in scrubs with careful hands and no name that mattered. But Admiral James Kincaid was asking for her. The nurses had whispered it during her last day on shift before the suspension locked her out. The Admiral had woken from surgery asking for the major who stopped the bleeding. His exact words. Not the nurse. Not the woman. The major. As if he'd recognized something in her hands, in her voice, in the way she'd cracked his chest open with a scalpel and found the tear in his aorta and clamped it with the casual precision of someone who'd done this before. Which she had. Dozens of times. In a place she'd promised never to talk about, for people she was no longer allowed to remember, under circumstances that had cost her half her hearing and all her clearance and the right to ever speak her own name in public again. Laura sat in her car for 4 hours. Rain came and went and came again. At midnight, her phone rang, federal number, no name attached. She didn't answer. At 0247, a second call. She still didn't answer. At 0331, she started the engine. It turned over like it had been waiting, and she drove home through empty streets, the single dog tag visible against her neck now, no longer hidden, the compact broken in that moment when Kincaid had spoken her rank out loud and 14 surgical staff members had heard it echo across the trauma bay. She called no one. She told no one. She simply waited. The Pentagon security audit hit Oak Creek Memorial Monday morning like a tactical strike team executing a breach, sudden and unstoppable and bearing warrants. The routine background checks triggered by hospital records flagging Laura's classified security clearance, buried deep in federal databases, marked eyes only, under a name nobody at the hospital knew, brought 4 people in dark suits who didn't smile and asked questions that made the CEO's hand shake. They materialized in the administrative wing at 0815 with briefcases and phones that connected directly to people with stars on their shoulders. The conference room filled at 0900 with the hospital's power structure looking increasingly uncertain, the CEO, 3 board members, Dr. Ashford in his white coat with that expression of controlled confidence, and Laura summoned from suspension with a single text message saying only conference room B, 0900. She arrived at 0851, settled into a chair with her hands folded, her collar high enough to hide the dog tag but her jaw aligned with the posture of someone who'd survived worse than humiliation. Then Admiral Kincaid's daughter walked in, a woman in her mid-30s with her father's bearing and her mother's sharpness, and the air in the conference room changed like a pressure system shifting. She looked directly at Laura, her eyes finding hers across the table with the accuracy of someone trained in reading personnel, and spoke first, "You're Major Bennett. Dad woke up yesterday asking for you. He says you commanded field operations." The silence was so thick you could have sutured tissue in it. 100 beats of nothing. Dr. Ashford's confidence flickered like a pilot light, then guttered. The CEO looked at Laura with new eyes, the kind that see a stranger where they'd seen a subordinate. Hospital staff pressed against the conference room windows, their phone cameras already rising. Laura's hand moved to her collarbone, to the dog tag, the reflex unconscious and absolute. The hospital administrator picked up a file from the agent beside her when had the agent arrived. His federal badge was already visible on his suit jacket, and began reading with trembling hands. Her lips moved silently at first, then she forced the words out, Silver Star for Combat Valor in Sangin. 2 Bronze Stars with V device for humanitarian operations under fire. Navy Commendation Medal. Purple Heart. 2 Purple Hearts. Another 100 beats of aftermath. Kincaid's daughter went absolutely still. One of the board members stood up. Dr. Ashford opened his mouth and closed it, the gesture of a man who'd suddenly realized he'd been playing chess against a grandmaster and had already lost. The CEO sat down hard, his face the color of old bone. Then Commander Price walked through the door in dress whites, his bearing the kind that moved air, and Dr. Ashford's face drained from confidence to ash in the space of a breath. The SEAL commander read the rest of the file with the precision of someone reading a eulogy. Major Laura Bennett, United States Navy Medical Corps. 8 months commanding forward surgical team operations in Helmand Province. Combat trauma rate of 2.4% mortality despite 97% of incoming casualties presenting with non-survivable injuries. She ran that unit under active insurgent fire and saved over 200 lives before the IED that cost her half her hearing and her medical discharge. The room erupted into whispers. Kincaid's daughter started crying silently. The FBI agent in the corner spoke almost casually, his voice carrying the weight of federal authority. "We're also investigating an attempt to delete security footage of Admiral Kincaid's resuscitation." Hospital IT Director Marcus Chen reported that Dr. Ashford attempted to access and delete the recorded footage of that procedure. Mr. Chen is a Marine Corps veteran who preserved every frame and filed a federal obstruction complaint for tampering with evidence related to a flag officer. Dr. Ashford stood up and security, actual federal security, not hospital guards, moved to escort him out. He tried to protest something about hospital protocol and was cut off mid-sentence by Commander Price simply looking at him, and that look was enough. It was the look of a man who'd seen what kind of leader Major Bennett was and understood exactly what she would have done if given the authority and the clearance to act. Laura sat with her hands folded while the meeting continued around her, federal agents discussing investigation parameters and hospital administrators apologizing for what they were beginning to understand they'd allowed, and one single tear finally falling down her cheek, not from fear or vindication but from the weight of 3 years of silence finally, exhaustingly, ending. The dog tag hung visible now against her scrubs, gold catching the conference room's fluorescent light, the name stamped there matching the face of the woman in a Navy uniform in the photograph that Commander Price was showing the room. In that photograph, Major Bennett stood with her team in the Sangin Valley, her hand on the shoulder of a young corpsman, both of them sun-darkened and alive and carrying the kind of authority that only comes from surviving together. She'd spent 3 years running from this. It had taken 48 hours to dismantle her, and the entire Pentagon showing up to rebuild her. The Pentagon security audit hit Oak Creek Memorial Monday morning like a classified briefing dropping from the sky unannounced. Routine background checks. That's what the initial call said. Routine. What the hospital's compliance officer didn't mention was that someone, Kincaid, almost certainly, had flagged Laura Bennett's name in federal databases, and the fingerprint records attached to her civilian nursing license matched a major with a clearance so deep it made standard protocols collapse like a house of cards. 3 federal agents in dark suits were already walking the 3rd floor by the time Laura clocked in at 6:15. She didn't notice them at first. She was heading toward Trauma Bay 3, coffee in one hand and a tablet full of shift schedules in the other, when Marcus Chen appeared at the nursing station with an expression that looked like someone had just handed him a briefcase full of either cash or dynamite. His eyes found her across the unit and held. Marcus, the IT director nobody ever thought about twice, the quiet Marine who ran cables through the walls and fixed printers and had been here longer than anyone except the maintenance staff. He nodded once. Not casual. Professional. The nod a soldier gives another soldier when the operation has gone hot. The conference room door was closed when she passed it, but through the frosted glass she could see shapes moving like pieces on a board being rearranged by someone who finally knew all the rules. 2 hours later, Dr. Kwan from Human Resources appeared at the unit desk and asked Laura to step into that same conference room. Not a request. The quiet voice, the careful politeness, those meant something was about to restructure itself completely. She walked into a room full of uniforms and suits that didn't belong in a hospital. Pentagon official with an ID badge that said DOD. FBI agent with a voice like gravel and authority. A naval officer in dress white so crisp they could cut glass. And sitting at the table, hair pulled back, red-rimmed eyes, was Kincaid's daughter, Michelle. The same daughter who'd been in the ICU waiting room 48 hours before when her father's aorta decided to detonate. The same daughter who'd watched Laura crack open his chest. Michelle stood first. Her voice shook, but her spine was straight, Kincaid's daughter all the way down. "You're Major Laura Bennett," she said. Not a question. A statement the way you'd state a battlefield fact. "Dad says you commanded field operations in Sangin. He says you saved his life with," her voice caught slightly, "with a combat knife and hand steady enough to hold a person together when everything was coming apart." Laura didn't flinch. Didn't shift her weight. The composure held like a locked door. The hospital administrator, still holding the file that had landed on his desk that morning, read from it with fingers that trembled slightly. His lips moved silently over citations he didn't understand, over names of operations and deployments and classified briefings. The words of Major Bennett, honorable discharge, medical retirement, combat surgeon, 8-month deployment floated through the room like debris from an explosion nobody expected. Then the Navy officer in dress whites, rank insignia reading Commander, SEAL Team 3, leaned forward and spoke with the precision of someone reading a casualty report. "Silver Star for Combat Valor in Sangin," he said, each word its own sentence. 2 Bronze Stars. Navy Commendation Medal with V device for heroism under fire. Purple Heart. You commanded trauma operations under active combat conditions for 8 months and saved over 200 lives before an IED classified you as medically non-deployable. He paused. "That's not a nursing resume, Major." That's a legend. The conference room was so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights buzz and hum above the table like insects in amber. Laura's hands rested flat on the table in front of her. They were steady. They were always steady. That was the thing nobody understood about hands that had held a human aorta in place while rounds were incoming. Civilian tasks like sitting in a conference room while strangers named your medals were the easy part. But that wasn't the worst part for Dr. Ashford. Or rather, it was exactly the worst part, because it was the moment everything he'd built started collapsing in reverse. Marcus Chen walked through that conference room door 30 seconds later with a laptop and a smile that had nothing to do with happiness. Dr. Ashford attempted to delete the security footage of Admiral Kincaid's resuscitation, Marcus said, his Marine Corps background evident in the way he stood at parade rest while delivering information like a sit-rep. Made the request Friday afternoon. Said it was routine file management. I preserved every frame. 3 separate backup drives. One of which has already been transmitted to the Department of Defense. He looked at the FBI agent and nodded. Federal obstruction complaint filed Saturday morning. I have the communications logs, the deletion requests, the timestamp evidence, everything. The administrator's face went the color of hospital-grade antiseptic. Dr. Ashford's carefully cultivated empire, 30 years of board connections, political maneuvering, strategic alliances with people who owed him favors, started its collapse on Thursday when the hospital's legal team called him to a meeting. They presented him with 2 options. Resign immediately with a neutral reference, or face termination and federal charges for obstructing a Pentagon investigation. The second option involved the malpractice implications of his delayed response to patients during crisis situations, now documented officially in Laura's formal complaint and supported by 3 years of incident reports other nurses had been too afraid to file until someone gave them cover. He chose option 1. His medical license survived, but barely. No hospital in North Carolina would hire a surgeon who'd obstructed federal investigators. Private practice doors closed like airlocks. The whispers in surgical lounges, once his domain, became whispers about him. How he'd tried to bury a Pentagon admiral's treatment records. How he'd collapsed in the room instead of taking command. How the quiet nurse nobody respected had saved the admiral's life while a department head froze. 6 months after Laura cracked open the admiral's chest, after the Pentagon had cleared her credentials and the hospital had renovated an administrative position around her skill set, Dr. Richard Ashford began his night shift as security guard at Oak Creek Memorial. The only job his tarnished reputation could secure. He wore the uniform with the name tag gleaming under fluorescent lights in the parking garage, walked the corridors he'd once commanded, nodded respectfully to nurses who'd once feared him. His voice had changed. Smaller. The arrogance burned out like a fuse that had finally reached the powder. Laura saw him in her second week as Chief of Emergency Medicine. She was reviewing protocols in her new office, the one with windows and a door that closed and a title that meant something earned instead of granted, when movement caught her eye. Ashford, walking the parking garage, checking doors, the uniform swallowing him like the night. She watched for exactly 3 seconds, then returned to her work. The satisfaction she might have expected didn't arrive. Just exhaustion. The kind that comes from carrying weight too long, even after you finally set it down. The shadow box arrived 6 months to the day after Admiral Kincaid's surgery. Kincaid came himself, driving to Raleigh in dress blues despite retirement, and he walked into Laura's Chief of Emergency Medicine office like a man on a mission that mattered. His salute was sharp, precise, and he held it until she stood. Found it in the Pentagon archives, he said quietly, opening the box. Inside, her dog tag. The one she'd lost in the Sangin explosion that had taken half her hearing and all her clearance. Beside it, newly matched, was its twin. The paired tags caught the light like a sentence finally made complete. Thought you might want it back. Laura hung it on the wall of her office, beside the photo of her team in Sangin, their faces young and alive and worth every single silent year. The faces of the 3 Marines she'd saved with that field thoracotomy, the same Marines who'd carried her out when the IED detonated, the same Marines whose letters still arrived every Christmas without fail. She'd rebuilt herself once as a civilian. Now she was building something new, a trauma program that trained nurses and doctors in combat medicine, that valued competence over hierarchy, that never made anyone hide who they'd been to survive who they'd become. The single tear that had fallen during her humiliations had watered something stronger than shame. Something with roots. Admiral Kincaid visited monthly, always checking the same thing, "You good, Major?" And Laura, who'd learned that rank and title mattered less than the work, would smile and say, "I'm good, Admiral." Because true class is what you do when the lights go out, and hers had never dimmed, even when she'd convinced herself they had. If you found this story as powerful as we did, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a moment when ordinary people reveal their extraordinary power. Leave a comment below telling us, have you ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who they were standing next to? Your story might be next.